I'm a nurse. I tell a lot of stories to curious people who tend to regret asking right after. It's hard to find another job that matches the sheer breadth of human suffering I'm exposed to daily. The human body is an unbelievably beautiful and complex organism that can contort and be contorted in some wildly obscene ways, and I've had my fair share of horrible sights in my time. Wounds fester, gallbladders fill with stones, forks get stuck in eyes. We are precious little things, and the same body that can survive a fall from a plane can die from a stubbed toe. Not that I figured the survivor of the fall particularly wanted to live at that point. Anyway, my point being, everybody who's ever spent any time in a hospital has seen something gnarly that they'd rather leave behind forever. Even sitting in a waiting room can lead to boredom, that can lead to a peek through a door, that can lead to a burn victim convulsing in his bed. I always hope that the folks who take that home with them develop a new appreciation for life and empathy for their fellow man. Personally, I worked on the floor that said burn victim was treated on, and his moaning made me grind my teeth all night. Sometimes I want to put my head through the wall as payback for the god-awful thoughts I've had about people who were suffering and dying with the audacity to do it near me. It's not a job for everyone, it's hardly a job for anyone, but you get used to it. You sit in it and live with it. The hospital becomes this third place that no one else can really see. You look at a bed in the corner of the room and you remember the last 3 people that died in it. The fourth's face is already gone. It's good to remember, to appreciate, to hold the knowledge that they were real. They thought and felt, and it can fuck you up if you let it. It's only now that it's flooding back in. I let it flow through me, it hits and it goes. The wind doesn't knock me over, but little bits get stuck. They itch. Bad. Now I'm there again. I think I might be done with hospitals soon. It's been a couple years. Back then, I was at work every day and almost every night. My divorce sucked bad, and I thought it might kill me if I spent any more time at home than I had to. I'm good at my job. I can autopilot for days. Sometimes I sit in my car afterwards and can't remember a single thing I said or did the whole day. Nobody's ever complained. Nobody's ever given me shit from above. I'm not a surgeon or anything. I wasn't cutting hearts open with my eyes closed. I was often checking on people who were bedridden, replacing bedpans and listening to them complain in one ear as it went out the other. There's nothing better to tune out. When I'm in that building, I'm a nurse, not a person. I work and I forget. That kind of fugue state is not good for you, to say the least. I'd highly recommend trying your best not to get disconnected from reality like that. When it breaks and you come back to the surface, it hits like a truck. It kills. I know it. In those weeks I spent on autopilot, I slowly realized that I only remembered a single thing from every workday. One patient, in one room. He was an older man who'd been transferred from another facility after spending over a year in a coma. He was just some guy, some normal guy who, according to his family, had fallen unconscious while at home and never woke back up. They visited him sometimes, almost always alone. 2 young men and 1 older woman who would just sit with him for an hour or 2 and whisper to him, like he could still hear. It was a sweet gesture, I thought. Too many people are left by their families to rot in their beds. I think unconscious people still have some sort of awareness of reality, even blurred through the impossible layer of a coma. They were always leaving when I came in, sparing me a glance or 2 before hurrying away. One of the young men always had a certain angry tiredness to him, the circles under his eyes making his frown sharper. He always spent the least time visiting and held himself with a certain rigidity, hands always in his pockets. I was curious somehow, wondering who they were to him. And stranger, wondering why I cared at all. At the end of every day, I could only vividly remember being in his room, seeing him with his eyes closed, watching those people whisper and stand and leave. I didn't care about anything else, but I always remembered that, and only in retrospect. It started to keep me up. I worried my mind was making choices for me. It was always the same. I'd walk into his room. He was laying there on his back, still, eyes closed. His hands were always clasped over his chest, right over left, and his body was totally straight. I know some people find that creepy, like a corpse in a casket, but I sleep like that too, so it never bothered me. He just seemed so restful. I don't know what it's like to be in a coma, but looking at him, I always had a twinge of jealousy. Imagine the rest, the weight off his shoulders, dreams or empty silence. I thought I'd rather be him than go back to my house and my husband again. So, I always tried to make him comfortable. If his visitors had been by, they often left his head pointed to the side and his pillow jostled into a weird spot that didn't seem great for his neck. The blanket was always sloppily moved onto him, like they'd fussed with it and forgotten how to set it back up. I figured, why judge them for trying their best to make their loved one more comfortable? Who am I to know what he liked? Regardless, I tried my best. I'd readjust him, fix the curtains at the window, clean up his bedside table, and move the hair from his eyes. It always felt like the right thing to do. I always thought that he had a mild little smile on his face, an upturning at the corner of his lips, something slipping through from his dream or vice versa. Maybe I made him a little happier then. I started to focus harder at work, be present, work with the other older patients in my area of the hospital. I slept well. A few months into his stay, I ran into the tired young man on his way out of the room. His hands were out of his pockets for once, and he was clutching them together with a strange tightness. He was grimacing and breathing heavily. I felt my heart jump. I don't know what it was. I'd decided to bring flowers and nearly dropped them as he pushed past me and vanished down the hallway. I had to stop for a moment before I could make myself enter the room. The man in the bed was still there. He was still on his back and his hands were still clasped together. The blanket was halfway off of him, worse than usual, and I went to fix it when I noticed something I'd never seen before. He was wearing a ring. On his right hand, middle finger, he had what looked like a typical wedding band. I couldn't figure out if it had been there before, if I just glossed over it every time, if I was just put off by his visitor's behavior. It's not really permitted for long-term coma patients to have any jewelry or accessory like that. Who'd have let that slip by for this long? It had to have just been put on him. I wondered if the young man had found his wedding ring and snuck it back to him, which struck me as surprisingly sweet, though I hadn't heard anything about him being married, and none of the visitors identified themselves as, or acted anything like a spouse that I could tell, like I'd know. But there it was, plain and simple on his finger. I went to remove it and had it halfway up his finger when I second-guessed myself and let him keep it. I guess it just felt wrong to rob him of it after all the time he'd spent alone and unconscious. I let him keep it. I think about that a lot. It was the next day when everything started. I came in, fixed him up, and was drawing the curtains when he began to groan. It was a low, long, pitiful kind of noise, like a wounded man bleeding out on the floor alone. It lasted for so long. I immediately looked for any sign of injury or motion, but he still just lay there, mouth hanging open, groaning. It pissed me off. I don't know why. I hate to admit it, but it pissed me off. Something about the sound just got under my skin in the worst way. I wanted to hit him across the face. I held it in. Some of my co-workers came to investigate, immediately complaining of the sound. We all had this vague frustration with the poor man. They moved him to check for injuries despite my insistence that I already had, jostling him roughly as they flipped him over and looked at his back. There was nothing, of course. He stopped groaning after a few minutes, but it was enough to set us all on edge for the rest of the day. I still fixed him back up in a comfortable position, but there was an undeniable air of unease and frustration in the room. I left him alone. His visitors stopped coming. I never saw any of them ever again. Every day he'd groan and we'd all start to slip. It pushed our buttons until they broke. He was alone in that room and he was suffering, loudly. Sometimes he'd cry or shout, just for a moment, as if in fear. The patients near him became even more irritable. They'd push each other, yell from their beds, leave their rooms unauthorized to insult others from the door. We'd curtly get them back into their beds and then leave to argue with our co-workers. The whole place got nasty. I hated it. It was worse than being home. I spent a lot of time in my car. I was late. My supervisor was late. We left people in their rooms for hours. No one died, but there were too many close calls. Too many minor medical emergencies that almost became fatal. People in the waiting rooms would file complaints before their appointments even began. People I trusted and liked were fired, and I was glad to see them gone. The man still slept. I still took it upon myself to make sure he was okay. but I never did it with the care I once had. He started to move. He'd groan, and then he'd roll onto his side, or rub his arm with his hand, or cover his eyes. He fell out of the bed a few times. His skin started to bruise. Overnight, he'd managed to scratch himself with his fingernails that we'd neglected to cut. He'd have scabs I'd never noticed before. He started to groan less and scream more. He just never shut up. A doctor punched his nurse in the face and knocked him out. A bleeding patient was left waiting for hours. 3 scalpels went missing. I kicked a hole in the wall. The lights seemed darker, and they buzzed on and on. It felt louder than my own voice. The hallways seemed too long. I'd walked for minutes and only realized I'd passed where I was going after turning around to see I'd gone way past it. I started crying in front of patients without noticing, and he still cried and groaned and screamed. I could hear it from outside. I could hear it when I was asleep. Soon enough, I was the only one who'd stepped foot in his room. They'd been moving patients to the other end of the wing when possible, and spending as little time nearby as they could. I'm not sure if it helped. If there was ever any real attempt at intervention or investigation from above, I didn't see it. I think the hospital just rotted and we all let it. I still wanted to try, to keep the place afloat, to do the community the service it deserved, so I still went into his goddamned room. I was hoping he'd die by now, but I wanted it to be in comfort. The perception of time in a coma must be wholly incomprehensible, and I can only hope that his pain was physical alone, his moans the product of a biological reflex, his suffering only visible on the surface. I want to believe that he was just asleep. I pray that he could not feel. I noticed his ring again one day. The skin around it had begun to swell, and he was slowly brushing it with his other hand. Lightly, gently, up and down. It was uncharacteristic. His movements were often jerky, rapid, frightening. His moans whispered out, and his eyes moved lazily under his eyelids. I realized that I was just staring at him. The image of his body has always been unforgettable, but it struck me more than ever that day. I stood there for a long time before my instincts kicked in and I had a look at his finger. The ring was still so clean, almost reflective. The skin beside it had begun to turn red, and suddenly it seemed right to try and remove it. Whoever this signified a relationship to, they clearly had nothing to do with him anymore. Relief is a precious thing, and he deserved the little I could try to give him. I went to remove it. The ring didn't budge. Never before or since have I attempted to do something that failed so immediately as that. It just didn't shift in the slightest when I pulled on it. I still don't understand how anything could be on so tight, so stuck. It was unbelievable. I remembered how easily it had slid across his finger the first time I touched it. What seemed like so long ago now. It defied me. It felt wrong to even touch it. The reddened part of his skin felt hot. I was possessed with the urge to break his finger and force the ring off. I had to bite my hand to send it away. I fixed his bed as quickly as I could and escaped. I occasionally gave the ring another pull or two when coming by, just to reaffirm that I was feeling reality, that the world was not lying to me. It was just stuck, and there was nothing I could do about it that didn't make me feel sick. My divorce proceedings were coming up. I was going to be away from the hospital for a little while. There was a certain sick pull that made it hard to get away, but I told myself repeatedly that it would be good for me. It had to happen. I visited him again on my last night there. He'd stopped making much noise. His vocal cords must have been damaged at this point, and his general demeanor had changed. When I came in, he was arching his back, forehead pressed into his pillow, stomach in the air. His eyes were rolling back and his mouth just hung open. I could hear him, even still, whispering, long and quiet. His hands were still crossed over his chest. I just ran forward and took one in my own hand, and he, somehow, began to relax his posture and slide back to rest in the bed. It was the most directly he'd ever responded to something I did, and it scared me. I was immediately frozen, his fingers in my hand. He shouldn't have been able to react to anything. I still cannot fathom what kind of awareness he might have had at any point. God, if he was there the whole time, present but trapped. I stayed with him for longer than I should have, half terrified to leave, and half moved to comfort him. He still made me so So angry sometimes. The false rage that puts holes in walls. But that night I could not find anger in me. I pulled. I breathed past the icy fear and I pulled on his ring. My fingertips burned from the strain. The arching red marks left on them lasted for days. I grabbed his wrist with my other hand. I pulled. I put my foot against the bed. I pulled. I bit into my lip. My fingers slipped and dropped hard against the floor. My hands were empty. It was pointless. He looked at me, through his closed eyes. His body laid against the bed, but his head was stuck, perpendicular, recessed into the pillow, and certainly, obviously bent, twisted, his chin digging into his chest. And he stared. His eyelids couldn't hide that he was looking for something in the dark. The rest of his body was so still. Imagine the urge to right yourself as your neck cramps, your jaw tightens, and you can't even move your fingers. You can't even open your eyes. I coughed and gagged and crawled away in fear. I left him like that and hid outside. The sense of relief was immense at first. Being away from that environment reminded me how I felt in the sunlight. Everything smelled better. I didn't dig my fingernails into my palm. In court, it came back. I couldn't blink without feeling like my eyes would never open again. I listened. I spoke. I looked my husband in the face, and I left scrapes on the side of my chair. I've never had to explain this before. It's hard to make the hole in my brain feel real. I've never cared about anything that much. I didn't care about my own divorce while it was happening. I wanted to be anything else. I wanted to hurt myself. Nothing bad even happened. No one said anything, did anything. I just wanted to bite a chunk from my own arm every minute. Something wormed in there and made me sick. I threw up on the carpet before God and everyone. I was very nearly hospitalized. I was just so afraid. Afraid that something was going to happen. Something is always about to happen. It worked out. I'm single again. My ex-husband got a lot of things in the split. It's not the worst time anyone has had in a courtroom. Everything real seemed so small. I hit my head against the wall a few times and went back to work. The lights weren't on when I pulled into the parking lot outside the hospital. It was already late. The rest of the building was lit up as usual, but my wing was dark. A pit formed in my stomach as I sat there, craning my neck to see through the windows. Squinting, thinking. We were all professionals. It should never have been able to get this bad. For us all to slip. I still don't get it. The window went back into forever. Something far behind it was lit. A tiny light spilling from behind a cracked door. Something moved in front of it. I swallowed the fear and bit my lip. I still had to go to work. I had to turn the lights back on. A few people were moving in the parking lot, coming in and out, being pushed in wheelchairs and hurrying to appointments. It seemed like no one else had any feeling of foreboding, of an encroaching darkness. The lights were just off in one wing. I was just losing my mind. It was cold, and I was still alone. I hurried through the door and towards the first elevator. I always try to avoid looking too troubled at work. Being in a hospital is already a stress-inducing situation for most, and I'm very aware that watching medical personnel with grim looks on their faces can often make that worse. It's one of the reasons why I had been so frustrated with the recent state of the place. When we were all on edge, so were the patients, and I'll always hate that they suffered for our problems. Saying that, I know that when I walked through that lobby, I looked like hell. The people waiting nearby later cited seeing me as their first indication that something terrible had happened. How they hadn't noticed anything before, I can't tell. When those elevator doors opened, I pushed harshly past two elderly women who were exiting. One turned back, and whatever she saw on my face nearly knocked her over. I hit the button 1,000 times before the door closed. The elevator crawled upwards and I stood, clenching my fists, centering. The fog in my head was too strong. I lost track of too much then. I'd been in this elevator hundreds of times before. I'd left my mind empty as I autopiloted into work. I'd never noticed how quiet it was. Everything slipped through the cracks and into the shaft. My heartbeat was loudest. I went up. A distant sound descended upon me. Constant, so high-pitched I barely noticed it, growing in strength with every inch I went up. It was no human voice, no pained moans, no cries of fear. It was artificial, electronic, long and piercing and high. Overwhelming. It pressed me into the floor of the elevator. And it grew. There were more behind it, pushing through, together, harmonizing. Something on my floor was singing, in my head, in my head. I put my palms on the doors and felt the cold. The doors opened and the song broke. The metal slipped from under my hands and I toppled out into the noise, into the darkness of my workplace. The melody was gone. Now it was only sharp. It pierced me as I crawled out of the elevator, and only then, only when I looked up and around, did I realize what I'd been hearing. The heart monitors. The heart monitors in every room were screaming in the dark. Almost everyone in a bed on this floor had stopped breathing. Their hearts had stopped pumping. While I wasn't there. The one time that I wasn't there. They wouldn't let me forget. Not while their monitors could scream. It was still dark. I pulled myself up by the receptionist's counter and looked with the lights of the equipment and the little moonlight coming through the windows. And there was something in my head. The corners of my mind were folding in before I could take anything in. My hands were slipping. My eyes were drifting, closing. I took a pen from the desk and stabbed myself in my upper thigh. It broke the spell for a brief moment, long enough for me to stay on my feet and look around, glancing over a floor covered in strewn papers, pencils, medical utensils, shattered potted plants, glimmering pieces of broken glass, a leg. Someone was there, face against the ground. I stabbed myself again. Something hot ran down my leg. I looked behind the counter I balanced on. Someone was there too, and someone else. As my eyes adjusted, it seemed like everyone here had fallen wherever they were standing, during whatever they were doing, and it had been something. Some had put their hands on each other. There were scalpels and scissors scattered near them. I couldn't look over the noise. They were breathing. Some cut through the incessant noise of the heart monitors with heaving, convulsing moans, gasping, crying for air. But they breathed. They were still alive, alive and in pain, alive and unconscious. Suffering with their eyes closed. Dreaming. My knees started to buckle. I stabbed myself again. Again. My eyes began to shut. I dug it in and twisted. I walked while I could still feel my sock turn soggy, hurting while I could still move to do something about it. I passed by doors softly swinging and saw, briefly, feet under covers, hands dangling limp, eyes shut tight, and mouths hanging open. Every one of our patients here had died in their beds while I was gone. The pen broke in my thigh. I replaced it with the sharp end of my fingernail and pushed around the corner. In the back, past the sticky heat in my hand, was his room. He'd still be there like everyone else. I couldn't pick out his heart monitor among the rest. There was little reasoning to be had with the weight bearing down on me. I stopped thinking and kept walking. Thoughts and feelings can be difficult to recall when in the wake of something terrible. I was there. I remember what I saw, what I touched, but something in that hospital sits just out of sight. There's something watching from around those darkened corners that I don't remember how to see. It wanted me to close my eyes and collapse. It begged me to, and my only answer was in the tip of my finger. I don't know what would have happened if I'd let it put me to sleep. I think I came in too late for it to sink in like it did for everyone else. I think the scars on my leg are worth a lot. I groped further down the hall, stumbling past fallen bodies with one finger in my ear and the other in my leg. His room was just ahead of me now. It smelled like blood. It mixed with the copper stench of my dripping leg, and I ran the last few steps to the room. I hit the door and slipped. It was blood, pooling and crumpling my back against the slick tile as I landed. My head snapped up, and there he was. He was harrowing. The moonlight bathed him, and I saw. He was again arched above his bed, his back achingly curled, almost perfectly still. His teeth brushed his pillow as his spit pooled, his mouth distending in silent pain. And his arm was moving. It trembled forward, shaking, leading up to his hand. There it glowed, split. Flopping from the tip of his middle finger were the remnant flaps of its skin, glistening with strands of red between them. Under them, the fingers of his other hand, their own skin beginning to split as he pushed the ring, that ring, of course, up and out, through the skin, twisting, tearing the skin, Anything to push it up and off, finally off. He moved and he bled profusely, unbearably, but he moved in his unconsciousness to make something happen, to fight back. I ran my hands over the bloody floor as he slowly pushed, decoupling the skin from flesh, working it forward and through. The ring was bright as it carved. There must be something. There must have been something that I couldn't see about the ring, something I couldn't understand. It bit at me and I lunged against his soaking bed, throwing him against the wall, undoing his petrified arch, snapping his body limp as I wrestled with his gushing hands. The ring was dangling now, a centimeter of flesh and bone remaining in contact with it, sticking to the pink flaps of flesh now drooping over the tip. I gave it the extra pull. I tore away the skin and took my teeth to it. I tasted sickly metal, and only then did it come loose. The sudden release put me on my back again, and I writhed with the seconds of thought I had left. I twisted the scraps of flesh between my teeth. The weight pressed in again, so strong, and I watched the ring spin red against the tile as I left, at last. I know his eyes never opened. I was so afraid of what I would see when mine closed. I guess my worst thing isn't much in the end. Anyone who spends enough time in a hospital has seen flesh tear and blood spill. Really, it was him. It was what he saw. I saw something awful. He bore witness. He knew what I could only feel. There's not much left. We woke up. He was dead, incredibly so. Whatever he saw has no hold over him any longer. I have to dream. The ring was long gone when I came to in my own hospital bed. We were all reeling, some in ways that they never truly could make peace with. They saw. They all saw something, and they all forgot enough pieces of it to live. Many diagnosed instances of brain damage came from that day, but we lived, and we all had questions. There had been a tragic accident. Certain gases had been building up in the air, affecting our emotional regulation, that led to a sudden, spontaneous bodily reaction that knocked most of us out and killed many of our aging, weakened patients. It was a beautiful answer to square away what lingered, an excuse. I couldn't look at my co-workers much after. I always saw how we had been to each other before, and it pushed me away from that hospital for good. I wanted to believe with them. I want the presence I felt with that pen in my hand and those heart monitors singing to just be gas in my head. But it's there, right where I don't remember how to see it. Sleep doesn't comfort like it used to. Now, when I begin to dream, I dig into my leg until I wake. And then I wonder. I wonder if it'll be back when I close my eyes. If a stranger will visit me while I sleep. If I'll ever wake to feel something tight and warm on my finger. If I'll ever wake at all. Second story. I've been a nurse for almost a decade, and in that time, I've seen a lot. You'd think working in a hospital would desensitize you to death, suffering, and even the strange occurrences that sometimes happen on the night shift. But there's one experience I had that no amount of medical training could ever prepare me for. I haven't shared this story with many people, but the more time passes, the more it haunts me. Maybe sharing it will help, or maybe it'll just prove that I'm not crazy. Either way, here it is. I was working the graveyard shift in the ICU. If you've ever worked in a hospital at night, you know how eerie it can get. The quiet, the dimmed lights, the occasional beeping of monitors, it all creates this unsettling atmosphere. You're surrounded by life and death, and sometimes it feels like the veil between the two worlds is thinner than we realize. That night was slow, which in itself was strange. Usually there's always something happening, patients coming in, emergencies popping up, but everything felt still. There were only a handful of patients in the ICU, and the air felt heavy, like something was about to happen. My shift partner, Amanda, and I were the only two nurses on that night. We were sitting at the nurses' station catching up on paperwork when one of the call lights blinked on. Room 307. I remember this because that room had been empty for 2 days. The patient who had been in there passed away earlier in the week, and the room hadn't been filled yet. Amanda and I exchanged a look, a mix of confusion and unease. "Maybe it's just a glitch," she said, shrugging, but I could see the tension in her eyes. "We get technical malfunctions from time to time, but something about this felt different." I stood up and grabbed my clipboard. "I'll check it out," I told her, though my heart was already pounding in my chest. As I walked down the hallway, the lights above me seemed dimmer than usual, casting long shadows that made the corridor feel endless. When I reached room 307, I paused at the door. The air was colder here, unnaturally cold. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The room was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the monitors we keep hooked up, even when there's no patient. The bed was made, perfectly still, and the machines were silent. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I walked over to the call button and checked it. No malfunction. It had been pressed intentionally. My throat tightened, and I felt a prickling sensation crawl up my spine. I looked around the room, trying to find any logical explanation, but then I noticed something strange. On the bed, where the pillow lay undisturbed, there was an indentation, like someone had been lying there. My breath caught in my throat. I leaned in closer, squinting in the dim light, when suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Just a flicker, but enough to send my heart racing. I turned quickly toward the shadowed corner of the room where the light didn't quite reach, and then I saw it. A figure standing there, half hidden by darkness. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the light, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was real. It looked like a person, but something was wrong, terribly wrong. The shape was distorted, hunched, like it didn't belong in this world. Its face was obscured by the shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching. My blood ran cold. I froze, unable to move or speak. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing tighter and tighter. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me, as if it was waiting for something. And then, in the silence, I heard it, a soft, raspy whisper. "Help. Me." The voice was faint, like it was coming from far away, but it echoed in the room. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. I wanted to run to get out of there, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I don't know if it was fear or something else, but I couldn't move. "Help. Me." The whisper came again, more insistent this time. My heart pounded in my chest as I finally managed to take a step back, my hand fumbling for the door handle behind me. I needed to get out of there. But before I could, the figure took a step forward, emerging from the shadows. The light hit its face, or what was left of it. My stomach turned. The figure's skin was gray and mottled, peeling away in places, revealing raw, decaying flesh underneath. Its eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to pull me in, and its mouth hung open, twisted into a grotesque expression of pain. It reached out toward me, its bony fingers trembling as if trying to grab hold of me. I stumbled backward, crashing into the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I fumbled with the handle, finally yanking the door open and bolting into the hallway. I didn't stop running until I was back at the nurse's station. Amanda looked up, startled as I collapsed into the chair beside her, gasping for air. "What the hell happened?" she asked, her voice shaky. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come out right. All I could do was point toward room 307, my mind racing with what I had just seen. Amanda stared at me for a moment, then glanced down the hall. She didn't need me to say anything. She could see the terror in my eyes. Together, we went back to the room, but when we opened the door, it was empty. No figure, no whispering, nothing. The indentation on the bed was gone. It was as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew what I had seen. For the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I turned around, I expected to see that figure standing there, waiting. The whispers echoed in my head, growing louder and more urgent. In the days that followed, strange things started happening more frequently in the hospital. Call lights would go off in empty rooms. Patients would claim they saw someone standing at the foot of their bed, watching them while they slept. Some even described the figure exactly as I had seen it. Gray, decaying, with hollow eyes and a voice that begged for help. One night, a patient passed away in room 307. A perfectly healthy woman in her 40s, admitted for observation after a minor surgery. There was no explanation for her sudden death, no complications, no warning signs. Just gone. After that, I couldn't work in the ICU anymore. Every time I passed room 307, I felt that same cold chill, like the air was heavier there, like something was waiting inside, watching. I requested a transfer, and though I'm still working as a nurse, I'll never forget what happened on that shift. I don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was a spirit, trapped between life and death, looking for someone to help it move on. Or maybe it was something darker, something that feeds on fear and despair. But whatever it was, I'm certain of one thing. The hospital is a place where life and death intersect, and sometimes the things that cross over are not meant to be seen.